Mom, I'm a radical alt-centrist mom.
Moderation is a delusion people invent to describe themselves. That is amazing.
Having actual principled opinions on political issues and a nuanced understanding of conflicts is part of the problem. If I just discuss everything in vague platitudes which don't even have the appearance of representing a meaning, I can just fillet myself and simply frame my position as being neutral.
Are not the same as correct and incorrect. I mean, don't get me wrong, you're going to get partisans on either side that are going to say that they are, and I'm sure we can guess which side that you think is 100% correct. But they are not actually tests, they are just ways of seeing the world.
When the truth is that I just don't have an ideology while simultaneously wanting to cement myself in every political debate as an authority, and I don't want to be subjected to the bullying hate speech of people who disagree with me.
And there can indeed be moderation between the two, because not either one has everything correct.
You can't criticize me if I never had a consistent position to begin with. What's that, Mom? You regret your choice not to have an abortion? I support that. I only kind of have a right to live. So recently, and by recently I mean a few days before I started my hiatus, Marxist personality and political establishment cannon fodder H. Bomber Guy decided to write this thread on Twitter in regards to lay skeptic YouTubers and political centrism. Now, despite the fact that I am by no means a fan of Harry's, and I personally try to avoid making bedfellows of Marxists as much as I possibly can, aside from his arguments being structured around many of the same flimsy paradigms which perpetuate centrist ideas, like horseshoe theory, such as the left-right dichotomy, and that somehow being a centrist and not aligning with either side of the state-crafted political constructs that are the left and right wing, that makes you open-minded, which seems to be suggesting that centrism is the only way to be interested in actually discussing ideas or hearing other perspectives. He actually rose a decent point in his conclusion, which I'll elaborate more on after I explain the issues with the argument he proposed, because I see this sort of flawed reasoning quite often when it comes to criticisms of centrism, especially when it comes from identitarians. According to the left-right dichotomy, individualists who argue against the ethical legitimacy of any form of coercion are placed into the same category as collectivists who argue for their position based on ethical relativism, because it assumes that every ideology on the political spectrum seeks to implement some sort of policy plan on society through the state with force. In other words, if I don't think that a state should centrally manage all the resources in society and make criminals of people who attempt to engage in private speculation, and coerce me into associating in manners I don't find to be in my interest, then I must be arguing that I think people should be forced in associating in manners I approve of against their will. The left-right dichotomy asserts that somehow collectivists who believe in using coercion to subjugate the individual for the interests of political rulers are different from other collectivists who argue for the exact same things based on identical principles because their stated preferences for what they'd like to see happen as a result may vary on a superficial level. Fascists and Marx-Leninists, for example, both want centrally planned economies and demand cultural standards to be centered around the state's interests, but Marxists don't consider themselves to be nationalists and believe in a different form of social justice, class theory. But because one is focused on nationality along with income brackets, while the other is primarily focused on income brackets, they supposedly sit on opposite sides of the political spectrum. And also, the left-right political spectrum implies that there can be positions which exist between true dichotomies. A common example which can be found in mainstream discourse quite popularly is the debate between free markets and state control of industry. There are many people who attempt to bill themselves as being neutral on this issue, or supporting bits of one position but actually identifying with the other, such as advocates for social democracy. Now, Now, a cursory glance at this dilemma shows that it's impossible to propose anything deviating outside of these two presented positions. If you advocate for using coercion to steal resources from people and distribute them with the state, and for the state to arbitrarily define industries it doesn't want people trading in, and to again use coercion to stop people from engaging in those markets, then you cannot be somebody who rejects coercion and argues that society would be much better off without the artificial scarcity created by the state's management of the market. There is no position, ethically or practically speaking, that can exist which deviates from either of those two positions.
But they are not actually tests. They are just ways of seeing the world. And there can indeed be moderation between the two, because not either one has everything correct. Some things that the right say are true, some things that the left say are true. And yes, this is why moderation, otherwise known as compromise, rational alt-centrism, is definitely something that needs to be done. If you want to see your democracy carry on functioning.
So, the problem with centrism is really just the inverse of the problems which plague the left-right political model. And before people comment to point this out, yes, I am aware of the fact that centrism, like many other terms and stated positions within mainstream political discourse, has a disputed definition. For the sake of this video, I'm referring to centrists as they would define their own belief system, most popularly in colloquial use referring to the so-called political moderates. But I'm also going to be referring to centrism by its second definition it's most popularly affiliated with, as defined by Marilyn Ferguson in her book The Aquarius Conspiracy, which as a political philosophy argues that worldview shouldn't be centered around strict ideological principles, because ideological principles create biases which in turn create an exaggerated view of the world. That every ideology has valuable contributions, and the valuable contributions from every ideology should be applied to the existing political system. But it doesn't really matter anyway, because the problem with centrism as an ideology stands regardless of which of these two definitions you apply. The problem being that by rejecting the mere possibility of an objective principle existing or being applicable to any form of society, centrism loses all semblance of neutrality or active consideration for every ideology's contributions to politics like it claims to have, because centrism's fundamental premise is rooted in an assumption which is disputed, this being that no ideology's principles can be applied consistently to a society, and that any attempt to apply principles consistently results in bias which makes a worldview inconsistent. Centrism argues as a matter of principle that no principles can be applied consistently, and since centrism attempts to argue for the consistent application of a principle in society, this by centrism's own argument against other belief systems and principles would make centrism biased and therefore flawed. Which, for the record, is itself a fallacious argument, because someone has a biased worldview does not mean that their worldview is incorrect, just because the person in question has a bias. I, for example, am obviously biased against the state. Does that invalidate my mountains upon mountains of evidence which both empirically and logically refute arguments in favor of political authority or the notion that the state's involvement in society isn't detrimental? No, not any more than someone who argues in favor of political authority is automatically wrong because they're biased against anarchism. Centrism, in the sense of being a quote-unquote moderate, has a similar problem which is caused by the exact same issue which plagues the other brand of centrism. To put it simply, there is no such thing as a political moderate. But wait a minute, you big, dumb, fox, furry man, you might be saying. I'm a moderate. First of all, shut the fuck up, you petulant little oven-dodging piece of fucking shit! But secondly, this is my channel, and if you're even remotely familiar with my content, you'd know that I'm not going to say something like that without elaborating. For one thing, moderate centrists have the exact same problem which the former type of centrists do in regards to the fundamental inconsistency in arguing that no set of principles is fundamentally consistent as a philosophical principle. So, on top of starting from a disputed and logically inconsistent premise, their argument infers that there is no such thing as an objective ethical premise which can be applied within any sort of society. And as a result, their stance fundamentally will devolve into an appeal to consequentialism, i.e. a might makes right argument for their ethical beliefs. This is something which isn't even disputed by them if you go right down to it.
It seems to me, though, that a human right is a consequence of a principle rather than a principle itself.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, I really don't like this. I don't like the concept of, like, quote-unquote human rights, because our rights are determined by our fucking nation status, alright? That's how it's determined.
Yeah, and different people can determine what's a human right.
As far as I'm concerned, human rights are what we give ourselves. So we determine what we want to be a human right.
Because, I mean, because the whole human right thing sounds a lot like what anarchists would say, because it's like, you know, the whole reason that you would even have a constitution is to guarantee your right. That's the point of the state, is to guarantee your rights.
This, of course, can't even be considered moderate. At best, this makes political moderation effectively just a euphemism for authoritarianism. Which brings me to the main issue with both types of centrism also shared by the left-right political spectrum. Because true demonstrable dichotomies exist within logic, empirical data, etc., trying to conform to a gray area doesn't make any sense, nor could it possibly ever work in application. In fact, again, all it does is promote authoritarianism. This is because ethical dilemmas simply don't have gray areas. For example, in the ethical dilemma of A representing freedom of speech versus B representing censorship, it's not possible to be both in favor of or against both simultaneously. If you argue in favor of A, then you necessarily must be opposed to B, and anything other than A necessarily has to be B, and vice versa, because the only thing which can be A is A. So let's say, for instance, a centrist does attempt to apply the principles of censorship and freedom of speech simultaneously. Well, in doing so, they're necessarily censoring people. So it's not freedom of speech, it's just censorship. It's not applying both or attempting to take a gray area position. That's just authoritarianism masquerading as something other than what it truly is. Now, most centrists probably wouldn't argue in favor of political censorship, and that's good, because political censorship doesn't have any justification for itself and is a pretty evil thing to argue for. But then they're not centrists, because they're arguing that a single philosophical principle can be consistent. So in conclusion, does this mean that centrism is some sort of authoritarian trick? No, it means that centrism doesn't exist. Are centrists malevolent people? They could be. I mean, appeals to moderation along with the balance fallacy are exploited by the media relentlessly to sort of poo-poo the inconsistencies in the agendas of mainstream politicians or political initiatives. But in most cases, I think centrism is more just a result of intellectual laziness or an attempt to rationalize political discourse within the fundamentally flawed view perpetuated by the left-right political spectrum. People understanding that true dichotomies exist within philosophical discourse, but can only see everything as it's presented by the mainstream media and the state, and realizing that this is self-evidently inconsistent if taken to its logical conclusion. My channel is full of videos explaining natural law, objective ethical arguments, or how they work and could be applied within society. For those of you who are interested and new to my content, feel free to check some of those out. Anyway, that's all for today's video. If you liked it, please comment, rate, and subscribe, and I will see you all next time.